Islam, Shalom, I.S.L.A.M, Osio, Hola, Aloha, Bonjour. This is your brother Tarik Bey, Indigenous American Moor, coming to you live and in full effect. Thank you for joining me. Please like, share, subscribe to my channel, hit that thumbs up, leave a comment down below, interact with my content, maybe even hit that notification bell so you're notified whenever I'm dropping new content. I really do appreciate your viewership. I want to jump right into a topic that kind of has been weighing on my mind and my spirit for a good while now. It doesn't exactly have to do with my ongoing topics of reparations and what we can do to better our future, but it does somewhat tie into us making a better future for the children. It also might give people on an international basis, some of my international fans who did not grow up here in the United States, maybe like a small insight on what it might be like to grow up as a Indigenous American person, or a so-called Black person, or a so-called colored person or minority here in the United States. I want to give a little bit of a Moorish perspective, but I'll kind of want to go into the beginning or the origins of my own beginnings, and sort of how I was shaped by the world that I grew up in and my particular perspective on said world. This one really has a lot to do with growing up in the United States and starting life after the age 18 as a so-called African American, so-called Negro, so-called Black person, so-called person of color, growing up in America as an Indigenous person. I did not originally know the information of me being a Moor or the Moorish science aspect of life or the history of it. But as a young man growing up in elementary school, I was very interested in history and technology. I often told teachers, counselors, any adult who would listen, that I wanted to grow up to be a paleontologist or an archaeologist, and my third backup was a marine biologist. So they were very intrigued and surprised that a young man coming from my particular neighborhood or so-called demographic having such a large vocabulary and actually knowing the meaning of those words. And my I guess my ambition for actually wanting to go into a field of high science, even as an elementary or grade school student. So in America or the U.S., elementary school or grade school is from kindergarten to, how we did it in my particular area, it was from kindergarten to 5th grade. I know a lot of other areas go from kindergarten to 6th grade, but it was from kindergarten to 5th grade. And then it was a graduation ceremony in the 5th grade to our middle school, which contained 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. And then it was another graduation ceremony during the 8th grade to go to our junior. We have like a separate junior high and high school in the area in the Northern Virginia area, Alexandria. 9th grade had an entire school for itself. It was called Mini Howard. So from the graduation ceremony in 8th grade, we went to an all 9th grade school. And then from the all ninth grade school, we went to the high school, which was T.C. Williams, which was 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th. I only spent my 11th grade year at T.C. Williams High School. But, that's just, how the schooling system worked in my particular area and how we went through. But I'm gonna let you know, as a young man, my family, we always knew, I was always told by the elders in my family that we have Indian in our family, so-called Indian. So I always knew that we were indigenous, American Indians, so-called Afro-Indigenous. I always knew we had that in our family. I wasn't sure what so-called African lineage was in the family, because I never heard about, when I was a young man, I didn't hear about any of our ancestors coming from there. It's a little weird or strange, because there's certain instances growing up as a young man, and you don't really know, or you might not know, that you're under this status called black or Negro. You don't know that you're under these status. You're just a child, kind of ignorant to those parts of society. So in elementary school, I would say the first instance I had of maybe systematic racism, or being labeled, or being set apart, was when I had some European friends who I went to elementary school with. I'm going to mention that there was also a program, I want to say early 90s, and it even went back to the 80s and things like that, where counties would bus, I guess, certain people from one community to another part of the city to go to a different school, in order to diversify the schools, because some areas, some elementary schools or middle schools or junior highs were in predominantly Caucasian areas, European areas. Some were in Caucasianly Moorish areas, or American Indian, or so-called colored people areas. And both groups of people would go to their own separate schools, but integration and things like that, they tore down and demolished all of the so-called African American schools or people of color schools. They demolished all of those and kept the other schools for the Europeans, and they bused children from the other community, so-called minorities, so-called Negroes, any so-called minority, Hispanics, anybody who lived in so-called low-income areas, they bused them to the other schools in the so-called Caucasian or middle-class areas. And that's how they would mix the demographics of the school, so they would have a decent number for different kinds of state funding and things of that nature. So I was actually a product of that. I went to a school named George Mason Elementary School. Pretty good environment. I gained a great vocabulary. I was exposed to a lot of different things, different cultures, different ways of life. I was always a very observant and astute child. So I was open to a lot of new experiences. I loved learning. Like I said, I was always a history buff, science buff. So I love history and science. Just the mysteries of the world, I wanted to unfold at my fingertips. So I was always interested in learning something new, something interesting, something that actually interests me, even though a lot of times my grades didn't necessarily reflect. My intellect. I feel in the American school system, it was more a reflection of what we were force-fed, what we were taught, and a lot of that didn't really sit with me, wasn't really important, didn't really seem valuable to me in a practical way. And I feel it might be like that for a lot of other people here in America, especially so-called young black men, Moorish men. But all this is before I found knowledge of self, and I started learning Moorish science and started diving deeply into my genealogy and deeply into the origins of my own family, the genealogy and the study of the law. I didn't really start learning law and studying law until I found more science and started connecting the history, because that was already very fascinating to me. History and animals, that was my thing. I love animals. I love history, science, geology. I love that stuff, and I still do to this day. Very, very interesting, very exciting. I also wanted to speak on the various things that hold people who look like me back here in America that are completely out of my control. And when I say hold people like me back, I mean either target us, exclude us, or demoralize us in various ways throughout our lifetime. And this is from being a young child all the way up to the age of 18, even 21. And there's a stigma in America that people who look like me don't often live to see the age of 18. I heard this throughout the early 90s and early 2000s when I was a younger man. This was often said to me by elders. I often saw it on media, like movies and things of that nature. You grow up with movies like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, painting that narrative and that picture of the environments that people who look like me will grow up in and the things that we are exposed to. There's plenty of reasons why a lot of us might not make it, or the statistics might say we don't make it to the age of 18 or even 21. And I feel like somebody who looks like me, for a long time, it was like our lives don't really start until the age of 18 or the age of 21, because it wasn't guaranteed that we're going to make it there. And growing up with that, in your psyche, in your mind, just knowing that other people who look like you didn't make it, because I do have some people I know from when I was growing up who did not make it to the age of 18. It might have been, things like car accidents, different things that was, out of their control. I can't really recall anybody overdosing on a substance at a young age and not making it. I can't recall that personally, but I know different things of that happened. Self-deletion happens a lot. But a lot of the various causes that specifically target us are the prison industrial complex. The policing here in America historically started as slave catchers and night patrollers to control human capital or human chattel slaves. Also, just going missing, without a cause, without a reason, just going missing. You might be walking to work, you could be getting off a bus, you could be walking anywhere, you just could be traveling, a person could be traveling, doing their normal business and just never make it back home, in the body, or the person is just never found. That happens to a lot of our men here, and it's not really an alert. No alert goes up. Of course, not an Amber Alert for like missing children. Pardon me. And the Amber Alerts only happened because a young girl named Amber went missing, a European girl, I believe. And that's how it started. Because when people like me, people of my demographic go missing, it's not really a cause for concern, not for, the people who report on those things, nationwide news, even public news. So just going missing. And I want to say it's very important that we don't forget about the people who do go missing, because there was a mass grave that was found behind a jail in Mississippi that has been making the rounds on the media, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this. But it was found with over 200 plus bodies in a so-called pauper's graveyard. And a pauper is a word for like a peon, a peasant and a pauper. If you think of like Oliver Twist, in those times, they used words like paupers, they used words like peons and peasants. Those were the underclass. Those are people who no one cared about, people who did not have finance, who didn't have money backing behind them. And there was a mass grave that was found in Mississippi with over 200 plus bodies, and all those bodies were not inmates of that jail, and they were also using inmates of that jail to bury. And when I say they, I mean the so-called authorities, the police, the sheriffs, the guards, people who are in charge of that area of the jail knew that this was going on year after year. So it's a huge investigation that has to be had involved in that. And I believe a lot of those bodies are melanated men. I'm not sure if it's women and children, but I believe a lot of those bodies are melanated men. And I believe a lot of them could have to do with the systematic racism, white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan, extremists, hate organizations that target people who look like me, who target the Moorish Americans, who target the American Indians, who target so-called people of color, so-called Negroes, so-called Black, Latinos, so-called Asians. They target all of us, anybody who doesn't fit the description of a so-called white person. That's who the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan target. And I believe it has a lot to do with the people who are missing in that mass grave that was found. And that's just in our modern times. I'm not talking about something that happened during Jim Crow era, even though this institution and what happens to us, the people who look like me, goes back to the Jim Crow era. But that mass grave is in modern times. That's 2023, 2024. Another reason is gun violence in our community. Gun violence, a lack of awareness of using firearms properly, using guns properly, using our Second Amendment properly. That happens a lot. Gun violence, unfortunately, whether it's gang-related, whether it's an accident by somebody finding one and it going off, whether or not it's a robbery from impoverished conditions. Gun violence has a lot to do with a lot of our people, or even if it's police brutality, being shot by a so-called police officer or policy enforcer. Substance abuse, like I mentioned before, physical violence as well, and just being a targeted demographic since the Jim Crow era, segregation era, and even before. We face a lack of opportunities compared to other demographics here in this country. A lack of guidance, I feel, goes a lot to growing up as a so-called Black male here in America, a Moorish American, American Indian. Growing up here, I feel our people who look like me, as young people, we seriously lack guidance, especially if we don't have a strong, positive male role model in our lives. A father, an uncle, mostly a father. So I believe the fatherlessness, a lack of active fathers, and that's mostly due to systematic racism. It's not due to people who look like me just not wanting to be fathers, not wanting to be there. Because if you look at the statistics, once again, it was proven that people who look like me are the best and most active fathers in today's age. You can look at the statistics on that. Even Oprah Winfrey had to admit and say that so-called black men are the most active fathers in the modern age and era. But in my generation growing up, it was the war on drugs, which needs to end, because we know the war on drugs was only started to put people who look like me inside of prisons for the prison industrial complex. It wasn't to wipe out and to save communities, because it was not a war on drugs when the opioid epidemic happened. In the community that was being affected were so-called Caucasians, so-called white people, pale faces, Europeans. It was them. It was not a war on drugs when that was happening to them. It was a crisis. It was an epidemic. It was a problem that needed to be solved. All right? It was not a war. And we know this. We know this. A lot of people were mentioning that when the so-called epidemic crisis happened, that it wasn't a war on those people like it was a war on drugs back in the 80s and the 90s. It was completely different. They were destroying families, tearing families apart, destroying entire people's lives, not just the people who were incarcerated and arrested and were in prison as prisoners of war. Because if it's called a war on drugs, then the people who are taken are prisoners of war, POWs, and that's what our people have always been. The slave trade was not told correctly. Slavery was not depicted correctly. We were prisoners of war. Some of us signed indentures to be indentured servants. A lot of different things, but that's not exactly what this video is about. But it's more so about people who look like me, and specifically my origins growing up, and what it's like to, as a young man, to think about making it to the age of 18, and to thinking about making it to the age of 21 and not really knowing if we will make it there and how we will succeed after that. So setting up a life at the age of 18 and setting up a life and planning a future, setting up a life at the age of 18 and planning a future at the age of 21. I feel like that is a lot of time lost. I feel like that really is a lot of time lost, and it's mostly a loss on people who look like me. A lot of times we don't start to develop and grow up and really become productive and active members of the society as we should, because we are under this mental burden, this spiritual burden, this physical burden of potentially never even making it to the age of an adult in America, 18, or potentially not even making it to the age of a functioning member of society at age 21. Those are just some of the things. I'm definitely gonna most likely have to make a part 2 to this video, because I'm just scratching the surface. I didn't want to make this video too long, but I hope this will help a few of my subscribers and anybody who's out there who might be wondering what it's like growing up here, being a Moorish American, learning the science, or what my upbringing specifically was like, and some of the issues we face here in America, historically, and each and every day, even to the present, and what obstacles we might face in the future and how we can maneuver those obstacles. That's ultimately where I want to go with this topic. After getting reparations, how can we get them? What can we do once we get them, and how can we move forward so we make sure these issues do not persist and something like that never happens again. Because something we must learn from the so-called Jews, they always say the Holocaust will never happen again. And the Holocaust is a curriculum that is a required curriculum in public schools, that, it's required learning. They have to teach that history to make sure all peoples know that this happened to them, the plight that they went through, and that something like that will never happen again. And that's how they have been moving forward as a culture in this world, in this day and age. All right. Thank you for joining me. It's definitely going to be a part 2 to this. This is your brother, Tarik Bey. Wado. Peace.